Hello, and welcome to today's virtual program with Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. I'm Dr. Marina Toulouche-Shams, professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, and Division Director of Infant, Child, and Adolescent Psychiatry at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. Today, I am so honored to be in conversation with Professor Dacher Keltner, the founding director of the Greater Good Science Center, professor of psychology at UC Berkeley, and host of the award-winning podcast, The Science of Happiness. For over 20 years and more, Dr. Keltner has been conducting globally recognized groundbreaking research about our emotions. For example, how we can cultivate feelings such as happiness, awe, and compassion, and why it is so critical for our physical, mental, and emotional health and well-being to do so. Dr. Keltner has published over 100 articles and authored multiple books. Research has been carried out across multiple cultures and diverse population and speaks to the biological and evolutionary aspects of emotion that cut across culture, class, and resource availability. I couldn't be more eager to have this conversation today with you, Dr. Keltner, during these unprecedented and challenging times. If the audience has a question for Dr. Keltner, please leave them in the comments. We will reserve the last 15 minutes for answering your questions, so please do share them. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Keltner.
It's great to be with you, Marina.
So a lot of what I've been thinking about in knowing that we're going to have this conversation is what I and others who I've been engaged in conversations with in the community and at UCSF and San Francisco General at large, experiencing both personally and professionally, that given there is so much overwhelm right now, feelings of despondency, hopelessness, and that uncertainty, the question that I would love to ask you to start is just kind of where does one even start in terms of cultivating happiness in this context of our pandemic crisis?
Yeah, when you ask the question, how do I cultivate happiness when people are dying and enormous strain is placed upon our healthcare providers, and we now know that poor people and people of color are probably going to be disproportionately affected by this. It almost seems like a irrelevant question, right? But in point of fact, I think that the science of happiness is more relevant than ever to these hard times. What's really convinced me of the relevance of this science is it really works for people handling trauma, right? First responders, really on the front lines handling human suffering, in terms of cultivating a set of practices that are grounded in science that can guide us through these tough times. And when we cull, to get to an answer to your question of what do we do, when we cull the scientific literature, now thousands of studies on what makes us happy, it really pointed to three categories of things to be thinking about. And one is social connection, right, which is challenged today by social distancing and which is necessary and the like. A second is to cultivate the positive states that I've studied, like how do you find awe during this time? How do you get out and enjoy the splendor of spring? And then the third is probably what our audience is a little bit more familiar with, which is all the stress handling techniques, mindfulness, resilience, breathing, compassion exercises. And we know, if you can kind of find 5 to 10 minutes a day to practice those things, you'll fare better all the way down to your immune system.
Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought up the piece. You brought up a lot of great pieces that I want to ask you about. So one that you said, though, that's so key here is around social connection, right?
Yeah.
And our social distancing that many are saying we should actually be calling physical distancing,
Right.
and not necessarily social.
Nice.
How do we cultivate that construct around happiness that we know is necessary for happiness around social connection right now, even in just teeny small ways when we're feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, I ground the emphasis in social connection in just rock solid science that you probably are aware of, Marina. A paper published from 2011 looking at just vast data sets showing if you lack social connection, it costs Americans 120,000 lives a year. I mean, to
Hmm.
connect is to live and to be happy. And so in this challenge time, what we have to remember is, as E.O. Wilson, the biologist, said, to connect socially is our defining skill in our hominid evolution, right? It is our defining strength, is our embeddedness in social networks. Touch, being in physical proximity are a couple of mechanisms, and we got to turn to other modalities, right? We have to
Yeah.
use our voice, we have to laugh, we have to make eye contact, and then hopefully rely on technologies. We'll see if they prove to be useful during this time. I think surprisingly so in some ways.
Hmm.
Just to remind ourselves how sacred and precious for our bodies social connection is. And there are a lot of ways to go about it.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, after having a full day of
Yeah,
whatever it is that everyone is doing, that idea of just even if it's 5 minutes of a FaceTime call
yeah,
with someone, versus even just being on the phone with them. It's been very
yeah,
interesting personally to experience that. And I know that sometimes it's also felt like, okay, getting over that hurdle of getting on that. I think that's the piece of like, even if you could just do a brief little intervention, your data really shows. I mean, it's really compelling.
yeah,
Some of your research that's looked at if you can cultivate these brief moments of happiness, the effect
yeah,
that it has on our immune system, like to
yeah.
really help us cope and stay healthy during this time. Can you
Yeah,
talk about that a little bit? Yeah, I'd love to
yeah.
hear.
And what a wonderful framing, Marina. I mean, these kinds of things don't require that you travel to the Himalayas, that you sit cross-legged, that you take 2 hours out of your day. I mean, time and time again, what these studies show is, like you say, like a minute or two of sort of thoughtfully practicing a gratitude exercise or kindness directly affects your immune system, and then those of other people. I'll give you an example. Um, Gratitude is one of the real success stories in the science of happiness. It's
Hmm.
replicated with kids, adults all over the world. And if you just take a moment to think thoughtfully about what you feel grateful for towards a person, why you feel that feeling of gratitude, what they did to make you feel it, and then you just express it to the other person. Um, there's work by Sarah Aljo and others showing it leads to oxytocin increase.
Hmm.
It leads to a decline in the cytokine system, right? The inflammation markers of that branch of your immune system. So just a
Yeah.
few minutes here and there during the day really matter during these times.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the youth and families
Mm.
who we serve and in the community right now, and really it's impacting everyone. But how do you even kind of remember to do that when our distress is so high that trying to figure out how you're going to pay rent, how you're going to buy food, all of the fiscal consequences that are occurring?
Yeah,
How, thinking about
yeah.
how do you build that in, or you're running around taking care of your children while you're
Yeah,
trying to work. There are all this interference, if you will. If
yeah,
I feel like even on a best day it might be hard to put in that 1 to 2 minutes. So thoughts about how we can, I mean, is part of this about acceptance? um, Sometimes I wonder if, like, we first kind of need to just accept that this is our current situation, and that sometimes can free us up to have a little bit of space.
yeah. I mean, one thing I really hope our audience kind of reflects upon is the science of happiness is not a substitute for structural problems and they are being revealed daily in the United States. And I think
Yeah.
it's safe to say, as we just learned today and yesterday, African Americans are disproportionately affected by COVID. Poor people, it's almost certain to happen, as with every health problem.
Mhm.
And I hope it's a time that we think about that collectively, as you have been in your entire career, right? That
Mhm.
this is the central issue. I will say it's so interesting, as you know, we did a lot of research looking at the influences of privilege and poverty upon these practices. And you find lower class people are more likely to feel awe on a daily basis. They practice a little bit more gratitude, right? So this actually may be a strength that grows out of necessity that we
Mhm.
should remind ourselves of. And then what I take heart in is how inexpensive and simple these practices are, right? That getting to a park, building a nice park, getting outside. And then, yes, to answer your question, ultimately, part of what we all are facing is sort of a an awareness of what this reveals about our society. And if you're poor, it means you might not have enough food to eat right now. And how do we handle that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was going to ask you about is, how you just brought it up, is how you cultivate happiness in the face of racial bias and structural
Yeah,
racism,
yeah,
and actually in this particular case too, like histories of years of negative interaction with the healthcare system. I mean, um, so and I actually wondered if you could talk a little bit about histories of trauma and how your work with happiness and awe. I know that you've done an amazing study with veterans
yeah.
with trauma histories, and I think it's important for um, folks to know about how that those data really led to massive improvements for people with trauma histories.
Yeah, like you, Marina, as my career progressed, when I was really struck by two literatures. And one is the health disparity literature, which has its origins at UC San Francisco in some ways.
Mhm. Mhm.
Wow, for every health problem, poor people are affected more, right? Any kind of health issue, it just hits them harder, in part because poverty hurts the immune system, as we now know. And then the second literature that really struck me that led to this study is trauma. That it is not randomly distributed. That being exposed to violence and mental illness and other forms of trauma um, really hits the poor harder, and it hurts our nervous systems and our immune systems. And I was lucky to work with a guy named Stacy Bear, who was a veteran who ran the outdoors programs at the Sierra Club. And I'll note, the Sierra Club is getting hundreds of thousands of people outdoors for free. Lots of them are poor, lots of them are veterans. Outward bound, three quarters of their students that they get out every year are poor, right? So these are real world, inexpensive interventions. And we had been doing a lot of work on the benefits of awe in nature, right? Just getting outdoors for a couple of minutes, looking at some trees, looking at a redwood. We even have a school teacher in the Bronx where there isn't the natural beauty of
Mhm.
Northern California. She takes her kids out on awe walks and gets them to really
Mhm.
perform well in class. And we know awe quiets the stress response, quiets your inflammation in the body, which is very problematic for health. So, given that, we took veterans and inner city kids who many had never been camping. And they went rafting on the American River in California, where ironically I used to go rafting as a kid. And we just followed their cortisol, stress hormone, and well being over the course of a week. And we find teenagers under resourced after just a half day of rafting, great drops in stress, greater happiness. And then the veterans.
Wow.
Veterans have about 2 to 3 times the rate of depression as average Americans. Veterans had a 32% drop in PTSD. And
Wow.
again, it's back to this theme you were saying of little bursts of this can really help
Mm.
us during hard times.
Yeah, I those are pretty compelling findings, which is why I wanted to ask you about them. I think this little bursts phenomenon is really um, huge. Bruce Perry, who is an amazing child medicine psychiatrist, very well known in motion regulation and trauma work, did an amazing podcast and was really speaking to our telehealth efforts and therapeutic efforts, and
Mm,
that really to help children and families self-regulate during this time, that we may need to rethink telehealth sessions not as just translating to 50-minute sessions, that now just doing them through video, that we're doing 15 minutes 3 times a week, really to help our youth and families to self-regulate. It's kind of this piece of what you're saying. And the other, I'm really glad you brought up awe, because I really wanted to ask you more about this and your line of research in this area, because I was looking at a Twitter feed. Someone posted on Twitter, and I don't know how many of those in our audience saw this post as well. I think it's gone kind of viral, but basically asking people to post a photo of a place that they visited that they've loved, or a landscape that's inspired them, but not to have any person in the photo. And the tweet says, "Let's travel the world together," with this idea that, some of these photos, and I was looking at them, they're what a lay person or someone may call like awe-inspiring. And I wondered if something as seemingly small as that is what your research would support, like eliciting that to improve our emotional and mental health and well-being.
And that question, Marina, is so timely for today when we're saturated, we're following statistics and death rates and, just to keep returning to little bursts of these states and practices that get us happiness. We know from lab studies in the lab that a couple of minutes of watching beautiful nature or reading about an inspiring person, like Nelson Mandela, shifts your neurophysiology, elevates vagal tone, for example, the vagus nerve, which helps your body be strong, right? Virginia Sturm and I are about to publish a paper. She's at UC San Francisco, where we did what the Twitter feed suggested. We did it a while ago, which is ask people who are 75 years or older, who are vulnerable or more likely to be depressed and anxious, to get out and go find a spot that gives them awe, right? Once a week. They go out, they find the swings that they used to rock their kids on, or a beautiful tree, or a pretty part of a city. And over the course of 8 weeks, they feel less anxious and depressed, right? So these little bursts of awe shift our brain out of a self-worrying, ruminative style to a open to the world style, which is important for us right now.
And I wanted to ask you, so related to this and the importance, is the accessibility of awe. I'm very curious about that, because it seems so salient and relevant to cultivate. But is awe like an unusual or rare or privileged experience? Because I feel like that's kind of how we think about awe, that you're lucky to experience awe, or some privileged state.
Yeah, and there are a couple of myths about awe that really we need to dispel ourselves of. One is it's rare, and we've surveyed people in 30 countries, and they feel awe about 2.5 times a week. They'll go outside, they'll see a leaf fall out of a tree, or they'll hear a child laugh, or whatever it is, and they smell a flower, and they will feel awe. The second thing is that it's not really about that rarefied trip, right, that comes with privilege. It's everywhere around us. And in fact, my former student, Paul Piff, down at UC Irvine, just published a paper showing people with fewer resources feel awe more often, right? So they're finding it in a story of a friend or their grandmother, or a spiritual text, or the magnanimity of somebody in the street. So it's part of our everyday life that we really need to return to.
And I saw a piece by one of your former students, who's now a professor at Arizona State University, Lani Shioda. And one of the things that she said that it's just still sticking with me, which is that, she said that actually awe stimuli are all around us.
Yeah.
And we just don't realize it.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if, that's something that anyone can do, that it's accessible, this awe, and that if we can figure out a way to have that be part of our small bursts,
Mm.
that may be something that helps to give us some relief, some impact on our health too, because your data, like as you were mentioning, really shows affecting the immune response too, which is so critical in our time of trying to stay healthy in this pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, a lot of the great thinkers have come to the conclusion that so much of the world is filled with wonder, right? You know, this is Plato's basic hypothesis as voiced in Socrates, that everything is filled with wonder. All the questions start in our imagination. You see this thinking in a lot of the Eastern traditions as well. And I was astonished, Marina, you know, we gathered 2,600 narratives of awe from around the world. And this is, you know, India and China and Mexico, Brazil, Costa Rica, just all over. We just went out and just asked people what gave them awe. And it blows your mind. I mean, people are feeling awe about, you know, something their dad did in a bar, and a can opener and a painting, and or you can't believe their car. It's just what the mind is disposed to do when it opens up. And what that tells us is exactly what you're saying. You know, it's like if you go out and look for a little awe and you just take a little breather and step back and not try to achieve your goals in that moment, suddenly you go outside and like, oh my God, there are these tiny little fungi, and you take a picture and off you go, right? So, and that's, you know, one of the interesting things about this study with Virginia Sturm at UC San Francisco is we had people go out and do this awe walk once a week, right? And they look for something that gives them awe, they take it in. And what we found is as they did the walk, their awe increased over time. They were finding more occasions for this emotion. So I feel like this emergency or crisis gives us a chance to slow it down and ask questions like, wow, what's awesome around me right here that I can go spend a moment with?
Yeah, I mean, it's really it feels like something most accessible for everyone to perhaps be able to cultivate, um, and so I have many questions about awe, but one thing that you just brought up actually was about spirituality
Yeah.
and religion, and you know, we were just talking on our UCSF Grand Rounds this morning about um, spirituality and religion, and how for many families, many communities, that is such a source of not only social connection, but really coping and mental health and well-being supports. And I wondered how your science of happiness and awe and your emotion science fits into spirituality, and that maybe that's a framework that people are already engaged in, and how that all fits in.
Yeah, you know, I really appreciate that question, Marina, because very often places like UCSF, you know, Berkeley, et cetera, there's not as focused an attention on spirituality when most Americans have a spiritual practice. And yeah, and I think that I really take William James's perspective of pluralism, right? That we're after transcendent feeling. We're after some kind of mystical state. We know empirically a lot of things about that state, which is it quiets your selfishness. It quiets a region of the brain called the default mode network, which ruminates and critiques yourself. It is good for your body. There are a lot of studies showing that a spiritual practice helps with how you handle disease and life expectancy. And there's new work that really suggests that part of the core of it, which was William James's hypothesis in Varieties of Religious Experience, is I want to be connected to something larger than myself, right? And he called it the fundamental it, because he wasn't a spiritual person. He's like, and he actually found it taking nitrous oxide.
That's
a whole other
different
story.
Talk, Doctor.
Yes, happy to talk about psychedelics too. You know, and I'm sure your whole audience is like, but what about psychedelics? And that's part of it. You know, that work shows 66% of people in some of the studies of psychedelics have a spiritual experience. So I
Mm,
think we have to embrace, right, in a pluralistic sense and say this is part of the human psyche.
mhm,
And where do you find it? Is it yoga? Is it meditation? Is it a spiritual text? Because it's part of who we are,
mhm.
and important for us to have it be part of this conversation.
Yeah, and I think that that piece of like finding where it is that it fits in for you, that
Yeah,
these are our emotions. And so
right.
they actually are accessible, they're a biological construct with us, like they're with us. So how do you access them? And in these tiny bursts, and you've been talking about some potential ways of doing so, even in our social distancing, getting outside. So what can we do even in a, I am figuring out how to get my two daughters out of the house every day, and I make them, even if I can't get on a walk, to run around the block somehow, so that way. And and so so the next part of my question
Yeah,
actually goes to actually being a parent,
yeah.
and a couple of things around that. So I know that you've written a white paper recently all about awe that's available on the Greater Good Science Center website. And one area for future research that that's going forward is around what does awe look like in children.
Mm,
um, and I'm very curious about that
yeah,
question. Um, and the other question I have related to that
yeah.
is, can we cultivate, can, can parents cultivate happiness and awe in their children? This is something, right, where if we're really distressed, what happens with our kids in this way? And is it something that we can teach them in some way or cultivate in them? How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, right? So
I
the
know.
first broad
Yes.
question, no, no, but it's really, ultimately with the science of happiness, what you want it to do is you want it to make it for a better society, right? A healthier,
Mhm,
fairer, greener society.
mhm,
And I hope we've provided some hints to that. It should be able to help veterans who are really suffering or the poor, and then it should be useful for and helpful for parenting. And I think it's really interesting that the indirectly a lot of the great literatures on parenting are really lessons about happiness, right? So
mm,
one of them is Feldman's work on the neurophysiology of parenting, mind blowing.
mhm,
Moms, dads, gay people, straight people, roughly the same parts of the hypothalamus are involved in parenting. It produces this big oxytocin surge and engages dopamine networks, which basically means you have this oceanic connection to who you're
mhm,
raising, no matter what your orientation, and it's filled with like trying to approach them and engage in delights with them. So that tells us, and then there are a lot of behaviors and practices that help us with that approach to parenting, right? Like play. I always teach excessively the virtues of play because we know it really helps kids navigate morally and learn empathy and so forth. There's a rich literature on awareness that I'm
mhm,
sure you teach, which is and study, which is when parents can slow it down, maybe through a little mindfulness, and in the
mhm,
heat of family life, just say, hey, how ask questions, get children to reason about hard emotions, right? Those are a couple simple ideas. And then it's so funny you ask that question. There's just now starting to be a science of parenting kids in awe. And there's
mhm,
this new paper out or about to be out where if parents show some nature videos to their kids, which are nice controlled stimuli, little 5-year-olds,
mhm.
um, they become less egoistic, and and more altruistic, right? So I think there's going to be a real growth
Interesting.
of that interest.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think when I've been talking to parents, both professionally and personally, in my own experience, uh, there is also this feeling of that, and I think this in part depends on the age of your child, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
um, how much information do you keep from them about your own distress? How much do you show? Do you express yourself?
Mm,
How much do you share with them about what's going on with if parents are experiencing like significantly increased anxiety, the
yeah,
communication patterns we know, like information's not being shared, so then kids will become more anxious.
yeah.
Um, and so I think about how these,
Mm,
back to these tiny bursts of cultivating happiness and awe in ourselves as parents, has got to have some sort of positive effect on our ability to be available emotionally in a high time of stress for our children.
yeah.
Um, but I don't know if there are data around that yet. So, but I think what I'm just trying to say is that it feels so overwhelming in so many angles.
Yeah.
And even if we can engage our kids um, in some small way, like I was saying, if I can talk to my children or encourage another parent to talk to their children about when they go on that walk,
Yeah.
take a look and see, what that flower is. Just stop for just a second, like physically stop for
Yeah.
a second.
Yeah.
That small moment could potentially have huge ramifications, positive ramifications.
Yeah, and your question is so pointed, Marina, that I mean, first, in terms of parenting during this moment, and kids are getting stressed out by the numbers and the data, and even just the idea of a virus and a plague, and it's a new kind of threat, right? At the Greater Good Science Center, I would encourage the parents in our audience to
Mhm.
go there, greatergood.berkeley.edu. We have a whole parenting initiative, and we
Yeah,
have
awesome.
essays on how much information should you be taking in. I've taken in too much information.
Yeah.
How much should you pass on to your kids? How do you talk about it? When having raised two daughters who are now in college, um, I do feel like this generation, like the way school is, the test-driven, high stress, high stakes environment, we've lost a lot of awe and wonder and wandering in education. I was lucky to wander a lot in my youth, right? And to wander as a teen
Mhm.
and early adult without firm answers or goals. And without that, life would not have been the same. So we got to fight for that.
It's really interesting that you brought that up. So, um, I was having a conversation just this morning. I'm just pausing for a moment because, yeah, I think it just speaks to like shared experiences and
Yeah.
conversations, right? That people are having. But I was talking to a colleague in Philadelphia this morning. We're collaborating on various juvenile justice reform efforts and mental health reform efforts. And she shared with me that her girls are who are tween, early teenage, but that they're actually in some ways doing better right now because
Yeah.
their school pressures have really slowed down, and so they're actually doing all of the work, and um, but that like their anxiety. So it's this like effect opposite to what she was anticipating.
Yeah. No, I know.
Um, so this concept of slowing down
Mm,
for some, whereas others, it's felt like completely the opposite,
yeah.
speeding up.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that your work on the science of emotions and cultivating happiness and awe could be applied in either of those to
Yeah.
help.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, just the broader emphasis on slowing down, and awe does give you a sense of expanded time, which is another benefit.
Hmm.
Marina, I did this really revealing exercise yesterday that speaks to your friends' observations about their tweens. I had my Berkeley happiness class online, couple hundred people, teaching over Zoom,
Sure.
hoping I don't get Zoom bombed and all the wonders of today, which I did in another context.
Uh,
And I did this exercise, which is a reflection exercise, which is first of all, just name what you're worried about, right? And I had them put that into the chat function of Zoom. And I got all these words we would expect, right?
mhm.
Confused, worried, isolated. frustrated, tired, lonely, stressed. And then I said, now, what good things are coming out of this? Like, what do you envision changing? And there was this flow of acts of imagination where they're like, I'm slowing down. I'm listening to my mom. Yeah. I'm having fun eating. Where I cooked a meal. It was incredible, right? And I do feel like something good will come out of this with our social patterns.
I I have been thinking the same. I've even been thinking about, um, seeing the reports of people getting together spiritually in the churches, which has been scary from a physical distancing
Right.
requirement and wanting
Right.
people to remain healthy. But just the outpouring of need for that social connection and kindness and compassion,
Yeah.
right? So that's another small burst of something that can be done,
Yeah.
right? And so it can be something just so small, but saying something kind to whomever
Yeah.
you're, and the literature shows that actually,
Yeah.
that along with gratitude, kindness, and compassion. So, um, yeah, I think that we have to, and maybe this is another, I'd ask you, this is another component of cultivating happiness and awe, is to actually look for the silver linings in our
Yeah.
situation and actually what's going to keep us going for the long run, because we know that this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
um, but does that help? I mean, to like use the cliche silver linings, like, are those moments of how we can cultivate happiness too, to think
Yeah.
about what you're bringing up?
Yeah, and I just want, number one, there's this whole silver linings. What's good about this? What am I grateful about this? Um, just list a couple of things, right? A couple years ago, we had a very serious illness in my family, and that's when I really was using that technique the most. And it would just get my feet back on the ground. Okay, whatever life presents to you, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, there's always a beautiful sky to look at or some flowers, and you are here. So silver linings, things you're grateful for, even in the hardest of circumstances, really is powerful. And I'm struck by the kindness, and I think that's going to be, you know, and again, I would encourage the audience to kind of think about the following, which is, we know really inspiring content, things that are uplifting, tends to be very viral in times like these in terms of what we want. And very often our traditional sources of media don't provide them. Find them on your own. Um, and then, I think that very traditionally in hard times, people rise, right? I'm struck, when I go out on my social distancing hikes, you know, when you pass another solitary human being on the trail, they look like they're in Antarctica and there's someone
Yeah.
who's going to save them. And there's kind of a raw kindness to build on right now. So,
Hmm. Yeah. And I think, particularly too, that's something that at UCSF is really, the caring for each other and the
uh,
compassion and the kindness and bringing that forth in really every domain that you're in, and understanding that everybody copes differently with stress. Um,
yeah,
and your work on your science and the Greater Good Science Center really helps us to think about just what are these very small ways that can have really significant impacts, which is so relevant to this time because, it's not about getting a 45, if you can't, 45-minute workout, or if you
yeah,
can't, even, I mean, really, when we're talking about the hardest of times for people who actually
mm,
can't get out of certain situations
yeah,
in their homes. We know that
yeah,
we have significant increases in domestic violence
I
situations
know.
and things. And so thinking about
Yeah,
ways that we can be part of a collective interest
yeah,
and kindness, compassion, and helping, even when everybody might feel depleted.
yeah,
And I think your work on happiness and cultivating happiness and awe has a place for that, like, and for providers too.
yeah, yeah. And I want to draw, it's so great to be in conversation with you, Marina, because the ultimate test of the science of happiness is right now, and it's how does it help people facing trauma? How does it help the impoverished? How does it help somebody in prison? And I've
Yep.
seen it in play in prison, and I know you work with the carceral state. And
Yes.
I'll draw the audience's attention to an MD, Michael Amster, who runs a chronic pain clinic, and has just done work that's gotten really great findings, is doing a larger scale study in partnership with our lab, where you just have kind of every few days you do a little 5-minute awe exercise, right? You watch an awe video, you read an awe-inspiring story, you think about someone who's inspired you in your life, you read an awe-inspiring quote, and he's finding dramatic reductions in chronic pain. And
Wow.
you know how hard chronic pain is on the psyche.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
as tough a
It-
problem. And
It's
here's this,
intractable, it feels like.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this is a
Wow.
time to think out of the box, right? And to build the
Yes.
person. So
Yes, absolutely. Wow, I'm really glad you shared that. And I will say that I've been thinking about this a lot for the youth and families with whom we work, and even about how we can leverage technology for this.
yeah,
So even text messaging
yeah,
to youth and families, or to how, like, just thinking outside of the box in this way to help with those little bursts that have these huge impacts that you're talking about. That's incredible. um, so it looks like we're going to move into our Q&A, and so I am sure that we have many exciting questions. While I am waiting for those, um, I one other can I indulge in one other question?
yeah,
Um, I'm really curious about this. So, um, there one of the papers that you wrote was about highlighting that maybe not all types of happiness are good for you,
yeah,
that happiness might not be suited to every situation. And in fact, in some cases, it can lead to being less inhibited and taking more risks. And
yeah.
I'm thinking, there's these data of the Bay Area with the alcohol sales surging and lots of happy hours online, and really like concerns for those of us who are involved in substance use
Mm,
interventions. But I just wondered if, and I'm seeing questions coming through too. But I was curious, is there a moderation to
yeah.
cultivating happiness that we should be considering?
Yes. Thank you, man. It's so good you're here because I may have led
So good
people
you're
astray.
here. It's so good
Yeah.
you're here.
Well, I get carried away on like awe for everybody, compassion, right? And the vagus nerve and oxytocin. And then I was humbled by this finding, and it really begins with the idea of harmony, which is really a deep idea in Eastern thought, but also Aristotle. And Aristotle, in his book on ethics, talks about, like you said, moderation, the principle of moderation. And he said, you need all of the passions, but you need them in the right way, to the right degree, and in the right context. What he's saying is moderate amounts of passion. And
Mhm.
we had a paper where we found people who had really elevated vagal tone. And that means their vagus nerve really fires a lot.
Yeah.
And vagal tone predicts connection and caring and sharing and so forth. But if you have really elevated vagal tone, you connect with way too much stuff, right?
Mm.
Inappropriate people, you are way too compassionate, you have no boundaries, and it's problematic. So that tells us we need moderate but healthy doses of these different passions and practices we've been talking about.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, so one question, and actually it's a topic we didn't get to. We talked about parents and children, but we didn't talk about relationships
Yeah,
as much. And so one question was, what are possible tips, skills, or exercise to use at home with your partner? It seems many couples are tense and often reflecting the fear of unknown on one another.
yeah. Well, one of the nice things about teaching is you get to keep tracking many people's scholarship. And I really like the problematic behaviors that John Gottman and Bob
Mm,
Levinson documented of, excessive criticism, stonewalling, contempt, where you look down on people, and defensiveness, where you kind of punch back if there are difficult times. Criticism, contempt, stonewalling, and defensiveness. And those predict divorce, right? Very strongly in their work. But you can think about the complements or the counterpoints to those. So Shelley Gable at UCLA has really nice findings on capitalizing on the good, just coming in
mhm.
and kind of thinking about, hey, what's one good thing that happened today? There's a lot of work on, nonviolent communication, of speaking in a way that's open, that's very richly documented. And this is a good time for forgiveness too, just to, you know,
Yeah,
these are hard times. People are losing sources of income. Things are,
absolutely.
yeah, this is tough, and it's time to practice a little bit of those ethics.
Yep,
And
yep.
I think we have a lot of that at greatergood.berkeley.edu.
Yeah, I saw that you have a lot of resources, yeah, for couples. So definitely check out the website. It's pretty amazing, and the programming. Um, so this is getting at maybe a little bit of some of what we talked about, but maybe not in the same way. Is there a way of cultivating a genuine, heartfelt sense of gratitude when the feeling is not there?
Yeah. I mean, and it's funny how that question arises really profoundly with gratitude, right?
Mm,
And I think um, because we're told to be grateful and to say thank you, and your parents pull you by your ear, and make sure you say thank you and be polite out there. My parents didn't do that, but um, but yeah, I think when you think of these practices, cultivating a little bit of non-judgmental awareness and mindfulness, cultivating some forgiveness where you get out of the default orientation of like, you're at fault, right? Cultivating kindness
mhm.
or gratitude or even awe. I think the wisdom in those literatures is you got to give yourself a little time. You can't
Mhm.
force it, right? You got to set your intention, get in the right context, and then practice it like we would practice anything, like a French
Right,
accent or the guitar, right?
right.
Is just build it into a practice. And the data show once you get it rolling, and this is true of gratitude, it tends to become more,
Sticks.
yeah, sticks and habit
Mhm,
like. But you got
mhm.
to approach it like a practice
Yeah.
and not fake
Yep.
it.
Yep. Um, great. So this is interesting. It brings up a different feeling, emotion. How would you recommend reconciling with guilt we may feel
Mm.
if we're focusing on the silver lining and what we're grateful for in this situation, yet we know so many people in the world are suffering?
Yeah, coming out of the approach that I take, kind of a functional or these emotions are good for us. There are actually a lot of data on guilt, like by June Tangney,
Hmm.
showing to the right degree what your mind is signaling to you is, hey, there's harm out there that you could help with, right? And wow, you get to do your work from Zoom at home, but a
Right.
lot of people got to hop on the subway and get their work done.
Yep.
And that's a signal. That's a moral signal that says take some action, right? And
Yeah.
June has really nice work showing those feelings of guilt, not only are they okay and common, but they motivate effective behavior. And so I think not to beat yourself up about them. And then, at the Greater Good Science Center, we have this wonderful essay on how to deliver a good apology.
Oh, I
and
haven't seen that.
apologies are really important during these
Mm.
high conflict times when we step on people's toes, right, at home.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if the guilt's local, be mindful of how to say you're sorry.
Yeah. Yep. I like that the piece about motivating to move forward and do something. That's um, so kind of opposite to the relationship question. there's a question about, for those who are sheltering alone, what are some tools we can use to make sure our mental health remains as healthy, and doing what they can, but it's very isolating.
Yeah, I mean, Marina, is just like you. This is one of my biggest concerns, right? Is, we know loneliness is tough on the immune system.
Yep.
We know loneliness is Vivek Murthy, our former Surgeon General, has a book coming out on it is almost like an epidemic. And now we're in this situation that is augmenting it. And so I really would, it's going to sound very familiar, but we put together some insights at the Greater, like one of our first essays in response to this emergency or crisis was about, here's 6 things to do. And one that I find during this time, I'll get into Zoom world and on my laptop, and then it's 4 p.m. and I'm starting to feel funky, right?
Same thing.
Yeah, and the essay says, like, get outside, have a regular connection, move your body, find something that gives you some beauty or gratitude. Just build that into your day, and those are, tried and true approaches to this. And then I just think about the connections that will matter right now and go after them. I've been finding, and I think a lot of people have, like, wow, there's some interesting new dimensions to my social life that are emerging.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But there's a great essay on that at the Greater Good.
That's great. So another question, examples of awe moments that can be practiced at work or as a team, which is interesting, especially from working from home. So this question is making me think of, are there things that we can build into our team meetings, our organizations?
Yeah. So I'll give you 2. And one is, it's astonishing. I do this a lot. I was just teaching, right before the emergency, I was teaching 500 medical doctors at Kaiser Permanente about awe. There's a lot of interest in awe as a form of medicine, and they know it, right? And so this is a team practice, which is you give a little space and you say, let's share some awe stories about what it's like to practice medicine. And man, once you get over the obstacles of, like, well, what do you mean by awe? How do you define it? It's vast, and then the stories start coming out. It just inspires you, right? So that's one, is sharing your work-related stories. What in medicine, sharing stories of other awe-inspiring people, right? A cancer patient, a child who's, dealing with a health condition. And then my colleague, Leif Haas, who's a medical doctor, is on the next episode of the podcast on using mindfulness as a medical doctor during this crisis. He actually gets his teams to dance. And dancing has this kind of collective joy that can blend into awe. So get creative.
Yeah, I have been hearing about, actually, one of our division directors at San Francisco General Hospital for the, I'm just going to show, so Trauma Recovery Center, because they're doing amazing work, and they are having meetings where they're having dance parties to start the meeting on Zoom. So, and it's going really well, and people are really appreciating it. So that's great. I was so glad you brought up the dance parties. So let me see. I think we probably have time for one more question. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through for just one second. I think that there's a question about, and this actually sounds like it relates to the question we were just talking about, organizational and teams, but it's very specific to supporting healthcare providers and health service providers during COVID-19. So you were talking about your MD colleague who's doing that with his teams. Are there other ways in which we can support healthcare and health service providers through the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, we actually have a whole online class on applying this at work with people within their own fields doing this. And then we're building an online healthcare institute that applies, it has medical doctors and nurses and administrators within health talking about how they apply this in the hard, fast-paced work of a hospital, right? With tailored
that's amazing.
and nuance. Yeah, so there are a lot of ways to do it. I would go again to the Greater Good Science Center website. Get to ggia.berkeley.edu, ggia.berkeley.edu. It's all free and it's ready to use. So, and we're working on it.
That's amazing. So that's an eventual online opportunity, of course, for people in the healthcare service industry. That is amazing.
Yeah.
I'm going to end with a last question, actually, from me,
because
it's an Inforum tradition to ask all of our speakers the following question: what is your 60-second idea to change the world, Professor Keltner? Let's hear it.
Well, I think that this emergency or crisis, whatever you want to call it, and our conversation today tells us that we need to return to the everyday sources of wonder and awe. I, like a lot of people, feel like that is like Einstein. Without mystery and awe, there's no science or art. And I think that we've gone astray in our habits, and there's all this wonder around us. And if we can just get back to those roots, a lot of things head in the right direction.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Keltner, for joining us here today at the Commonwealth Club and the Inforum. If you'd like to watch more virtual programs or support Inforum's efforts in making virtual programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Professor Toulouse-Shams. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was just an honor.
Thank you, Marina. Honor for me too.
Take care.
You too.